Of the Albany Housing Advisory Commission to order. I will read the land acknowledgement. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupy the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Lashon. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt that is owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home. Could we please call the roll?
Yes, Commissioner Cantu, Commissioner Marks, Commissioner Ramirez, Commissioner Winkler, and Chair Tiedemann.
Here. With that, we will move to our consent item or approval of the minutes. Are there any questions on the minutes from members of the commission? Seeing none, are there any public comments on the minutes from our last meeting of April 2nd, 2025?
If you wish to comment on the minutes, come up to the dais or use the raise the hand icon.
Seeing no one in the room, and I think seeing no one online, I will look for a motion. Then moved and seconded.
That was Commissioner Marks who moved and Commissioner Cantu who seconded.
Thank you. Could we please call the roll on that motion?
Yes, Commissioner Cantu. This is to vote on the minutes, and if we can all speak in our microphones, that will be helpful.
Yes.
Commissioner Marks.
Yes.
Commissioner Ramirez.
Yes.
Commissioner Winkler.
Yes.
And Chair Tiedemann.
Yes. Thank you. With that, we will move on to public comment. This is for items that are not on our agenda, where each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes. As a reminder, the Brown Act limits advisory bodies' ability to take up and or discuss items that are not on agendas. They will be referred to staff for a brief answer or possibly referred to future agenda items. And in this and all comments to the commission, please address your comments to the commission. Be respectful of your fellow members of the public, as we want everyone to feel comfortable and safe while making their comments. Are there any speakers who would like to speak on items not on the agenda? Seeing none in the room and
none online.
None online, we will go forward. That brings us to our substantive item this evening, item number 5.1, our discussion of rent stabilization policy. And I'll pass it over to staff.
Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Leslie Mendez, and I am the planning manager for the city. And tonight we will be discussing rent stabilization policies. So the purpose of the discussion is to discuss state rent stabilization protections and how they apply to the city, understand state limitations on local policy options, to explore options for a local ordinance, to gather feedback from the public as well as from the Housing Advisory Commission. And there is no formal action today, but I hope there will be discussion. So just some key definitions when speaking about rent stabilization. One is that rent stabilization itself limits annual rental increases during a tenancy, usually by a formula such as inflation plus a percentage. Rent controls are laws that establish broader price controls on the rent of residential housing and can limit or prohibit increases even across unit vacancies. Typically, however, rent stabilization and rent control are used interchangeably. Vacancy decontrol allows a rent to be reset to market rate when the unit is vacated. The owner may set any new rent without limitation. Pass-through charges are extra fees for improvements, costs such as utilities or parking or taxes and fees. Exempt units are units that are not covered by local or state regulations, such as newer buildings or single-family homes. And covered units, by contrast, are those units that are covered by local or state regulations. And then the Consumer Price Index is a measure of inflation that is often used as a measure in which to increase rents. So the state policy framework related to rent control, first and foremost, is the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995, which places limits on the ability of local governments to enact rent control. Specifically, it exempts from rent control single-family homes and condominiums and units issued a certificate of occupancy after February 1995. The act also prohibits vacancy control, thereby allowing landlords to establish initial rental rates for new tenants. With the goal of lowering the cost burden on households, reducing displacement, and promoting housing stability, the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, or AB 1482, modified by SB 567 last year and codified statewide, caps rent increases at 5% plus CPI or 10%, whichever is less. Single-family units, including condos and units less than 15 years old on a rolling basis, are exempt from the regulations. And these regulations are currently set to end on January 1st of 2030. Another codified law that I'd like to point out is Civil Code 1947.15, which is the principle of the fair right of return for property owners, which is grounded in the U.S. Constitution. The law states that property owners subject to rent regulation must be allowed to earn enough income to cover operating expenses and receive a reasonable return on their investment. That is not defined. And rent control ordinances must include a petition process for a fair right of return. So there is research out there on the effects of rent control policies on communities. And it is difficult to research because there's lots of variables and it's very difficult to compare apples with apples. However, it's because policies are not implemented in isolation, and there are many factors influencing a given housing market. It is difficult to isolate the effects of rent control from broader economic and housing trends. However, some general themes are that rent control does reduce displacement among long-term residents. By limiting rent increases, tenants are more likely to stay in place, which promotes housing stability, especially in high-cost areas like ours, where alternatives may be unaffordable. Particularly for low-income tenants, which are disproportionately people of color, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, this is true. However, at the same time, rent control may create a barrier for entry and place disproportionate cost on newer renters. On the other hand, some studies suggest that strict or unpredictable rent control can discourage private investment in rental housing. Developers and property owners may see reduced financial incentive or reduced income relative to costs to build or maintain their rental units. The state and localities have attempted to mitigate these issues through vacancy decontrol and exempting newer units from rent stabilization. Another concern is that rent limits may lead to deferred maintenance. If landlords have reduced income or fewer opportunities to recover the costs, they may underinvest in repairs or improvements, which over time can affect the housing stock. And finally, benefits are not targeted by income. Rent control typically applies based on tenancy. That means that higher income tenants can benefit just as much as lower income ones, as application, as mentioned, is based on the age or type of the unit being inhabited, as well as the amount of time of the tenure. So although mislabeled, in the staff report, it is attachment 3 of the packet tonight does have a summary of a few rent control studies, as well as hyperlinks to those studies if you wish to click on them and do further reading. So just some visuals on the effects of rent increases. So this chart is intended to illustrate how different policy approaches could affect average rents over time in Albany, starting from a common baseline. All of the lines begin with the U.S. Census American Community Service estimate of Albany's average rent in 2015, which was $1,627. A few caveats up front. This data does not control for unit size, location, or quality, and it reflects turnover in the market and incorporates the effects of vacancy decontrol. Therefore, not all of these increases are based on just an annual increase, but a decontrol reset. Additionally, there is a margin of error associated with the census data, and year-to-year changes should be interpreted cautiously. But that said, the blue line at the bottom shows a rent trajectory if increases were limited strictly to Bay Area Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. Some jurisdictions do apply CPI-based caps to help ensure that rent growth remains aligned with broader cost of living increases. The red line reflects the American Community Surveys, or the census's annual measurement of average rents in Albany. And this line incorporates all market changes, as mentioned, including new tenancies, vacancies, and general price trends. The purple line shows a hypothetical scenario where rent increases are limited by AB 1482's formula of 5% plus CPI with a 10% cap applied to a consistent tenancy. And while AB 1482 was enacted in 2019 and became effective in January 2020, it did require that 2020 rents be rolled back to March of 2019 levels if any rent increases during that interim period exceeded the allowable cap. And finally, the green line is for illustrative purposes only, and it shows what a total increase of 10% over the entire period would look like, which is the current maximum increase allowable under the Tenant Protection Act. This helps highlight the compounding effect of annual inflation and demonstrates the cumulative impact of even modest yearly increases. So together, these trajectories help us visualize how different policies or the absence of such regulations could result in significant different outcomes for renters over time. So this chart shows information a little differently. It's an illustration of rent changes by percentage increase, beginning with the initial application of AB 1482 in 2019, as expressed over a 5-year period. As in this prior slide, the blue, the Bay Area CPI is represented in blue, the ACS census average rents in red, and the AB 1482 increases in purple. So the chart highlights that average Albany rents, as measured by the census, have significantly outpaced CPI over this period. It also shows that even under the rent cap under AB 1482, rents could legally rise far more than the general cost of living. This underscores both the inflationary pressures in the local rental market and the limited nature of the state rent stabilization and controlling overall rent growth. So when we consider the application of rent stabilization in Albany, currently we do not have a local rent ordinance, so we are subject to AB 1482, SB 567 as a base of our regulations. The city has approximately 1,900 units, or a little less than 0.5% of all the rental units we estimate would be covered and are subject to state and would be covered by any local regulations. As we've discussed previously, we do not have a local rent registry, and nor do we currently have assigned city staff allocated to enforcement. When we discuss potential policy options that could be appropriate for the city, these may include things like creating more stringent rent increases or caps, such as lower percentages, and this is more stringent than state law, to provide for greater increases under certain conditions, such as if landlords pay for utilities, to limit the number of annual rent increases further. Currently, that is limited to 2 by state law, to require participation in a rental registry to monitor turnover, rent increases, and compliance, to reduce or refine exempted units. We are somewhat restricted in that, but treatment of duplexes, co-living arrangement, or to prohibit increases based on the number of occupants is possible. We could increase noticing periods for future rent increases and make provisions to extend any rent control regulations beyond 2029. And these, some of these different policy options are kind of further detailed in the staff report. So we get back to the rent registry. A proactive local program requires the establishment of an effective rent registry, which is the foundation of tracking and enforcement. Creating a registry includes establishing the system, collecting data, and ensuring compliance, typically through annual registration. Effective registries require sustained administrative support and a clear legal framework. There are both startup and ongoing staffing costs. Jurisdictions must budget for software, outreach, legal review, and personnel to monitor compliance, respond to inquiries, and handle disputes. Interviews with other jurisdictions indicate that a large amount of administrative time is required to inform property owners and try to keep them in compliance through mailings, reminders, and warnings, and to keep rental data current to accurately report changes in tenancies and property sales. So enforcement models may vary widely. Active enforcement includes regular monitoring, proactive audits, and enforcement staff. And these programs cost approximately $200 to $350 per unit per year. In contrast, passive enforcement models are primarily complaint-driven and cost roughly $50 to $100 per unit per year. So as we move to our discussion tonight, some questions I want to present to you, which are just a start and should no way limit other questions or discussion items. One is, should Albany consider adopting stronger local rent stabilization protections beyond state law? Could a local rent stabilization program be viewed as a safety net and not a correction of local conditions? How vulnerable are smaller mom and pop landlords to increased regulations? What trade-offs should the city weigh between protecting tenants and encouraging housing maintenance or development? Are there more equitable ways to protect renters based on need versus those who have longer tenure or live in older multifamily structures? How could a rental registry or stronger enforcement improve outcomes? And what tools such as incentives, education, penalties might support compliance from property owners? So again, these are just questions for thought and to respond to, and should not at all limit the discussion. That concludes my presentation, and I am here to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that presentation. In a second, we'll go to questions from commission members, but I wanted to note briefly for the public, we are aware that the agenda hosting site is having some difficulties. That's on the side of Ajax, the hosting server, not city side, and the city clerk is working on that. It does work intermittently, so if you're having difficulties, please reload the page, try a new browser, or try the desktop version of the link, and it should at some point work. Apologies for any difficulties there. With that, we will turn to questions from committee members, after which we'll go to public comment and then discussion from commission members. Would anyone like to start us off with a question?
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned there's the difference. There's two different types of, I guess, enforcement: the active and passive. And you talked a little bit about the active, but can you talk more about the passive type of enforcement?
Correct. Yes. So a passive enforcement, as mentioned, would be a complaint-based enforcement where a tenant or a neighbor or anyone can come in and say they aren't doing this correctly. So that would actually spur action by the city to follow up and with the property owner or the tenant. This is different than an active enforcement, which is something similar to what the city of Berkeley has, where there's an annual registration, there's audits that happen, there's certificates that need to be submitted, received in order to move forward. So Passive enforcement is typically what most cities use because an active enforcement takes a lot more resources in terms of time and energy and staff work.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question. So for jurisdictions that don't have any type of structure to receive complaints, either passively or actively, I guess the recourse for renters would be to make complaints to the state then? Is that how it would take place?
At this point, if you do not have a local ordinance, it would be a complaint through the state, the Department of Justice or what have you. With a local ordinance, it would be if there's things that are locally obviously different from what state regulations it would be the city that would need to enforce it. However, ultimately, if it goes to civil, action, it would have to go through state courts and not through city. So I think I kind of lost the train of your question there in my answer.
No, I think you answered.
Okay, great.
And sorry, another follow-up question. I think on the data that you presented either at the previous meeting or maybe a couple of meetings ago, I think you presented some data on the number of complaints that have been presented maybe at the state level for the region. I don't think there's anything specific for Albany, I can remember. But if I recall correctly, and I'm hoping you can remember, there weren't that many complaints, right?
Correct. The focus of the previous meeting, however, was on just cause for eviction. So those were specifically related to just cause for eviction and not to, that was the process for that. I don't think we have the data of, who may be charging more than the required rent.
We don't have the data.
We do not, no.
Other questions?
If you have any questions, Aaron, I'm happy to discuss his viewpoints.
Thank you. Once we get through public comment, we'll look forward to that. One question. I don't think I saw anything in the staff report about banking rent increases, which I know is something that some other cities have taken up as part of this. Was there any research done on that topic?
Research, no, but that is one of the lists of, I know it is there too. It is bullet point. It was there, units registered for rent. I thought there is, but that is another, there it is, number bullet point 3 under rent limits. It's allow banking of unused increases, such as like Oakland does that allows you to bank it for up to 5 years. So we'd have looked at different ordinances that of neighboring jurisdictions to see kind of summarized it. So research, not completely comparative matrix, but as we move forward, if that's something that the commission is interested in establishing, we would provide more detail on what other jurisdictions are doing for specific.
Great. Thank you for that additional detail.
One thing to add about the bank thing in Oakland, only because Dan KALB passed this right before his term ended. If the building is sold, the new owner doesn't have the right to access the banked increases. They're forfeited. So it's not automatically banked anymore in Oakland.
Thank you for that clarification. With that, seeing no other questions from commission members, we will go to public comment. This is for people desiring to address the commission on this item. And I assume everybody in the room, so we'll start in the room. Can we have people who are online raise their hands if they would like to comment? Or that's press *9 if you're on the phone, I think. And we will give everybody 3 minutes.
Sorry. Height challenge here. So, hi, I'm Dawn. I live here in Albany and I am a housing provider, AKA landlord is my preferred term actually. Anyways, rent control, housing is dependent on like supply and demand, and rent control will hurt. It hurts the supply side of housing. For example, take a family of 4. They move into a 3-bedroom Albany apartment. The kids graduate, they go off, they leave their parents behind in this 3-bedroom apartment. But because of rent control, the parents virtually have no incentive to want to move and leave the apartment, the 3-bedroom apartment. As a result of this takes a 3-bedroom apartment off the market. And so if there are other families who would love to move to Albany, another family of 4 who would love to put their kids into Albany schools, that's one 3-bedroom apartment that won't be available for them to try and rent. And so what rent control will do is it's going to hurt the housing supply in Albany, which is already in short supply. And it's going to leave a lot of underutilized apartments because people will be staying in these bigger apartments than they may need because of the rent that they're able to pay for this. So this will hurt housing and this will hurt Albany. And also what I would hope this commission would do instead is rather than focus on rent control, which will hurt the supply side, is to really dig down deep into the aspect of creating housing, not taking it away. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Next in comment in the room?
Hi, I'm Francesco Papalia. I've been worked in real estate for 37 years here in the Bay Area. I've experienced rent-controlled apartments in my business dealings. For 37 years. So I have a great experience in what happens inside of them and what happens when those things get sold. I also have experience in having lived in a rent-controlled apartment in the 80s when I was at Cal. And I'd like to share with you how arbitrarily rent control can benefit those who don't deserve it. And because it's arbitrary, it has never been anywhere a needs-based system where those who need it get it and those who don't. And I'm kind of shocked that you could consider treating the entire population of renters and property providers who arbitrarily, all the same. You're all the same. Landlords are all the same. Renters are all the same. In the 80s, I had a very low rent controlled apartment when I went to Cal. 3 guys rented the unit. I moved out. No, first one of my roommates moved out. I shared the low rent with one other guy. Then I moved out and the last roommate decided to stay, paying the entire rent because it was so cheap. After he graduated, he had a degree, a master's degree in computer science, and he got a fabulous job in Silicon Valley. And what did he do? He commuted from Berkeley to the Silicon Valley for 5-7 years. Why? Because his rent was so low here. And what did he do in that 5-7 years? He saved all that money that he saved, he used for a down payment to buy a house. Like, that's what rent control is for, to help a Cal grad with a MBA, a master's in computer science, get a fabulous job in Silicon Valley, and then not move to his job, but to commute. This happens more than you could think, because people are creatures who will take advantage of any advantage that they are presented with. So if they're given low rents, they always think, well, why should I have to move when I have this great deal? Dawn, I didn't know you were going to say that, but she gave an example. I'm giving you a real world example where a 3-bedroom apartment next to Cal was occupied by one person for around 7 years because the rent was so low.
Thank you for your comment.
Evening, Francine Riza. I am a landlord here in Albany, and the building that my sister and I co-own has been in our family since its inception in the 60s. And so we have treated this almost like our own home in the way we take care of it and the renters that we have there. And I wasn't planning to speak today, and I've written many letters about this, but I just don't see where a landlord, and I know there's many of us in Albany who respect our tenants. We couldn't have a business without our tenants, so they're as valuable to us as we are to them. And that's the way we treat our renters, and that's the way our renters treat our building. And I would just like to see that pattern continue, which would not be under a rent-controlled city of Albany. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Any other comments in the room? Seeing none, we'll go to online.
Yes, hi, it's David Danby calling in, and I'm going to sound a little different than everybody else in this case, but I have been reading about what goes on with folks who are experiencing homelessness and and how difficult that is for them. And our whole capitalistic way of charging for the cost of buying a house, for renting a place to live, to be a landlord, to provide services to people that need places to live. And it became clear to me, and I will be very honest with you, I don't have any solutions, but I don't think we take the time when we start a discussion like this to realize that our capitalistic society is very much involved with the profits of owning property and charging people for living in it or buying homes to move into and so on. And I would like to throw that out as something as you go through this process, and maybe I will come up with some more ideas to consider that. This is about taking care of people in our society and respecting them and trying to help them get to a place where they can live and live comfortably and be successful. And I do feel like the real estate industry is very much a matter of making profits and doing the best you can. And there are a lot of people that are doing a good job of trying to be very responsible and caring about people that need where they are, need a place to live. But that we need to do more about looking at that situation and coming up with some very caring responses. And I hope that makes some sense to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation on this topic. And I'm glad that there's going to be a discussion about it amongst all of you. A few points that I want to make is, first of all, I just like to suggest just you stop using the term mom and pop. It's so dated and it's so not representative of so many people's lives that I feel like you need to update it. But the other points that I want to make are, I noticed that there's something called fair rate of return. And I was wondering, this is a question, is fair rate of return, does that also apply to the fact that somebody buys an apartment building, for example, 50 years ago, and they rent it out for 50 years and it's gone way up. Now it's worth more than $1 million, and they probably paid, I don't know, $20,000 for it. So is that considered part of the fair rate of return? Because I think it needs to be taken into account that values of these properties go up, and that the renters are paying the mortgage basically for the landlords, and the landlords ultimately can do what they want. They now have these valuable properties and they could sell them, for example, and they would have that money, whereas the renters don't have that. I also want to point out that there are landlords that that wrote about this and are showing up at the meeting, and it's because we have no idea, no way of contacting the tenants in the city and letting them know what's going on. And I know that there's when landlords whatever register their property or license their property, that they have to put the address of the rental in there, but I don't understand why we can't have access to that so that we could reach out to renters to help them also come and force to meetings. Sometimes there's like a whole room full of landlords. I also want to say that I know that there are good landlords out there, and I really appreciate the people who care about their tenants and care about the property and have this mutual respect, but not all landlords are like that. And I think that it's just, I don't know, clueless maybe to think that all landlords are like that, because they're not. And then that leads me to also the fact that this active enforcement versus passive enforcement, the active enforcement is necessary because the landlords are not obeying the laws. There's a law that they have to register and they're not doing it. And so then they're not letting the city know whether they're raising rent or whatever's happening. So we have to then pay a staff member to keep an eye on them so that they'll behave. And so I don't think that should be a reason not to spend money on a program like this, that we have people who are misbehaving. And I think maybe the landlord should behave. I know I'm running out of time. Make sure I got everything. Let's see. Oh, and also just want to say, I really want to live in a diverse community, which includes people, a diverse economic situation, as well as people with disabilities, people of color, and older people. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Hello, my name is Kevin, and I'm a housing provider in Albany. I'm a small housing provider, and I just want to give some comments about my opinion on this additional rent regulation in Albany. I think it's not necessary for several reasons. The first, Albany already has a rent review program, and it already exists for several years to regulate excessive rent increase. And I think the city should collect more data from this program to see if there are a lot of cases of excessive rent increase before city implement more rent regulations. Based on my experience, I think there are very few cases of excessive rent increase in Albany since this rent review program was implemented. The second is Albany is a small city. It does not have the infrastructure and the scale to manage a costly rent board. And in the meantime, California already has AB 1482 that protects Albany renters with rent caps and just cause eviction protections. The third reason is that Albany should investigate other small cities, investigate the rent regulation of some other small cities. And those cities have been moving away from rent control, like Salinas, Concord, and Fairfax. Those cities have realized that rent control creates more problems than it solves. And I think Albany, as a small city, can learn a lot from these other small cities in Bay Area. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment.
Hello, good evening. This is Elaine Stelton. I just wanted to say, with regard to the woman who spoke about eliminating the word mom and pop, the words landlord and tenant are even more archaic terms, and I think those should also be eliminated. And instead, we should switch to housing provider and resident. I know for one, when my tenants move out They write me thank you notes. I care about them very much. When they call me, even in the middle of the night to say I'm locked out, I have turned up in the middle of the night to let a tenant in instead of saying, you know what, call the locksmith. It's your problem. It's your fault. I really, really think the majority of housing providers in Albany are really fine people. As a member of APRA, I can tell you we do our very best to educate as many housing providers as possible. Most recently, we had an educational seminar provided by Daniel Bornstein telling us what the laws are when a tenant moves in, when the tenants move out, so that we could be compliant. And I promise you, we will continue to offer those services to housing providers. We are a bit challenged in Albany because if I understand the numbers correctly, we have approximately 25% of people maybe renting houses or what have you who we don't know about. So you can't find them. I can't find them to try and educate them either because they don't have business licenses. And that's unfortunate, but I don't know how to fix that problem. I wish I could. I really do. I do think education is the answer. I feel that any additional rent control measures are unnecessary, and they're really collective punishment for the few bad apples we have. And I'm sure we do have some either uneducated or even possibly greedy people. And look, in every community, there's going to be some of those, but I really am asking you, please do not exact collective punishment on everyone. And my last point I'd like to make is you really need money to organize a program of any sort in Albany, whatever you might consider. And I know Margie Marks, for instance, has said, well, let's look to other cities we might be able to team up with. Well, Berkeley now has a $27 million deficit in their general fund. And also El Cerrito has been on the California auditors list, the red list, for many, many years. So we cannot look to our neighbors because they will soon be insolvent.
Thank you for your comment.
Hello, my name is Mike Zaraji. I've been living in Albany for 20 years. About 2 years ago, my wife and I worked with a local nonprofit organization that supports refugees into America. And we agreed to sponsor one. We provided what you would call a charitable accommodation at a very, very low nominal rent to this individual. So this individual can stay in Albany, settle, and be able to get their life in order and provide other support as needed. We have been watching the City of Albany meetings, the Housing Advisory Committee meetings, and we are very concerned that we will be locked into this very nominal rent in the future because we rely on this for our retirement income, and we cannot just do that. And unfortunately, we've made a very difficult choice to bring this charitable accommodation to an end. It's going to come to an end simply to protect us from any rent lock that are being proposed here. It's regrettable, but we have made that decision. I also want to say that we have a neighbor that also does something similar, that they rent a room to an international student at UC Berkeley at very, very nominal rent as well. And they're also bringing this to an end for the same reason. So these are what I would call side effects of very aggressive policies that are being proposed, and people, small people who rent rooms, rent little accommodations, people call us mom and pop or whatever you want, simply won't be able to support that. One last thing, I want to make sure that you take that into consideration if in anything you would come up in the future. I see the topic being rent stabilization. I don't see any difference between that versus rent control. It's just being a rebranded way of making it sound more moderate, but it's simply rent control. It restricts what housing providers can charge and put a burden on housing providers and makes housing limited for people who actually need it. There's plenty of topic has been mentioned here, and that should be taken into account. I'm hoping that you will never, ever come up with proposals that be a rent control, because it would be a bureaucratic nightmare. And you don't know who's going to be on it, what formulas they're going to have to control it, and it'll be even more chaotic than what we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment.
J. David Hertzer.
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. I have owned and managed 2 8-unit buildings for over 50 years in Albany. My buildings were built about 1960, so they're one of the older buildings subject to potential rent control. Is there a rent crisis in Albany? I see no evidence of a rent crisis. Before 2020, I often got 20 to 30 calls for a vacancy. Now I'm lucky to get 1 call a week, and my rents for a 1-bedroom unit are $17.25 a month. If there was a crisis in Albany, I would be getting a lot more calls. By the way, I want to contrast that $17.25 that I'm getting for 1 bedrooms from what Leslie shows on her chart, which I think is just ridiculous. My rents have not increased since 2019. My tenants were having a hard time during COVID, and I chose not to raise my rents. And I am typical of many small apartment owners. But now rents are going to have to increase. Expenses have exploded, and small apartment owners are in crisis. For example, because of the insurance crisis, insurance companies have increased their standards, and this really affects the older housing stock. For example, this year, in order to get private insurance, I had to upgrade my electrical, costing over $50,000. Also, I may have to replace iron railings, costing over $30,000. Second, SB 721, which is the deck ordinance, requires older buildings to upgrade their decks and upgrade stairs also. So anyway, and the cost for those stairs, for example, will probably run around between $30,000 and $50,000. So these are great expenses. So anyway, please consider the needs of the small apartment owners as you discuss rent control. The present rent review ordinance is working fine, and there's no changes that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Are there any further comments online?
There are not.
Thank you all for your comments. With that, we'll turn to discussion. Before we get started, I'll just ask my colleagues on the commission. I appreciated our wide-ranging discussion in previous comments, but I'll say that the more actionable, specific feedback we give to staff, the better they are able to convert the will of the commission into an actionable policy later. So I would encourage people to give specific commentary on things, on some of the notes and decision points that Leslie highlighted in the staff report, as well as offer your general thoughts as always. With that, I'll turn it over to whoever would like to start us off. You said you had some comments.
Of course. So starting overarchingly, Assar Lindbeck, a Swedish economist, said the fastest way to destroy a city is with bombing or rent control, because it just changes the dynamic of how the city functions. And he's famous for this quote, and it's been written and repeated many times by local economists, national economists. If you have rent control, you need to have means testing. Because if you don't, you let rich people squat in rent controlled apartments. This was actually a topic that I brought up at the state legislature. And I had talked to 8 of our senators, and I told them, I said, you need to, if you do means testing, you could free up a lot of units for low income people. And you could make a deal with the property owners that, okay, we'll means test. If they can pay market rent, they can stay if they want to. If not, you only get a moderate increase, but you get an increase to get some people out. Where did this all come from? Person walked through one of my open houses, told me a story about a couple of his friends in San Francisco paying $1,200 a month for a rent controlled apartment. One worked for Google, one worked for Facebook. In 08, 09, they bought 6 homes during the foreclosure crisis, never left their apartment in San Francisco. They're millionaires and they don't need to have a rent controlled apartment. So I think means testing overarchingly has got to be part of the discussion if you're going to do this. Personally, I think that using the state law is the right way to proceed. The state is only going to get stricter. They just recently tried to implement a 2% cap. This was pulled from the floor because they didn't have enough support to do that. But the state is going to continue to pass more and more regulation. And I think if you rely on the state, you could save the city money without having to set up a bureaucracy of a rent control board, et cetera. If we have 1,900 units that are going to be subject to this and you got $250 a unit, it generates a little less than $500,000 a year. Is that enough to operate that system and make it work without being a burden to the city? I do believe the city should take efforts to register all the apartment units, all the rental units, and the people that are not paying this, that is a terrible mistake. And that is one place of enforcement that I definitely believe we need to implement. Another thing, when you regulate a market, and you've heard me say this before, I think you have to regulate all aspects of it. Nobody is telling State Farm to not raise my insurance more than 5% a year. My insurance on buildings has tripled. That's a big cost for property owners. Residents don't feel that because they're just paying a fixed rent. I feel it in the cash flow and what I have to pay out. Same thing for plumbers, drywall, roofers, et cetera. Everything they consume is subject to inflation and to what market value is. And therefore, we have to pay a lot more to maintain the buildings. And if you cap the rental income increases and you don't cap these other categories, get displacement dysfunction, and then buildings tend to not get managed as well or maintained as well. People will do less work than would be optimally necessary just to squeeze by because they can't afford to make further repairs. Another thing that it does is it does freeze in place residents that have a rent controlled unit, especially if you don't do means testing. The example Dawn gave of a 3-bedroom unit and the kids graduating and leaving, in rent controlled cities, the parents don't go anywhere or the people don't leave because in some cases it's been quoted that having a rent controlled apartment in San Francisco is worth as much as a PhD after 30 years. You didn't have to go to school for the PhD. Just saved so much money over the 30 years in the rent controlled apartment. People talk about rent control as creating stability in housing. You know, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco is a huge homeless problem. They've had rent control since '89. Pretty significant that it didn't fix that problem because homelessness is still there. I myself gave examples about when I sold my properties in Oakland, I owned a lot of single of condominium homes. So 1-unit rentals that I had. They were all rental housing. I paid the RAP fees, all of that. When they passed the first TPA, I started selling them. And all of those units, those 12 units I owned, went from being a rental unit in Oakland to an owner-occupied unit. You will lose some people because they won't want to comply with this. It's very cumbersome. And I said then to myself and my partners, this is only going to get stricter in Oakland. It's not going to ease up. They're not moderate in how they're doing it. They're absolutely radicalizing the housing stock and they want to socialize it. And so, boom, you're going to lose some units. So you might have 1,900 today that are controlled. That could drop. That would affect you because people are impacted by that. So That's what I had on my notes, and I thank you for listening. And if I come up with something else I want to add, I'll let you know. Thank you all for listening.
When I retired from my full-time job, I looked around Albany, seeing houses sell for over $1 million and rents going up. I don't want to live in a place that only millionaires can afford. I educated myself on the housing element and housing in general. This topic of rent stabilization is very near and dear to my heart. I've listened to everyone and carefully read the letters that were sent to the commission. I think there are some fundamental differences of opinion, but I have great respect for those of you that I have a different opinion. I hear many times that the only real solution to solve the housing crisis is to build more housing. Look around Albany. We do not have a lot of empty lots. The housing element identifies pieces of property in Albany that could be used for housing. Appendix B of the housing element lists the available land. There are exactly 8 vacant lots that could accommodate a single family home. There are exactly 2 lots that are capable of accommodating 2 or 3 units. The largest vacant land in Albany that could accommodate housing is a 10-acre site on Albany Hill. When I first heard about that, I thought it would be great to build another affordable housing project like the Saha project, which has provided 62 below market rate units for the city of Albany. I spoke to our city council member, Jennifer Hanson Romero, and she turned me on to some other ideas for that land that could raise money for housing in Albany. I look forward to working with her to make that happen. Another way of combating the housing crisis, particularly for renters, is subsidies. The most effective subsidy for renters is through what's called Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher Program. The federal government administers this program through HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Agency. Based on their income, many renters in Albany are eligible for Section 8. I have heard from some unhoused persons that the city of Berkeley had some of their own vouchers, that the county of Alameda had some vouchers. The fact is there are not enough and there's a huge waiting list. When a tenant has a voucher, the landlord gets the full asking price for the rent. The tenant generally pays 30% of their income on the rent, and the rest is subsidized by the government. I sometimes think that by many appearances, Albany appears to be this upper middle class urban village by the bay. But you need to scratch beneath the surface to see what is going on, particularly with renters. Did you put that? I've asked Leslie to show a list of facts and figures for the city of Albany. All of the facts and figures come from the housing element. So our population is about 20,000. It lists the racial breakdown. And I want to say something about this racial breakdown. It doesn't list Hispanic, which I thought was interesting in this particular part of the housing element. In other parts of it, it refers to Hispanic or non-Hispanic, but in this particular section, it doesn't list it as one of the categories. I'm not sure why. So the white population is 47%, Asian Pacific Islander 31%. Hold on one second, I've lost my place. Multiracial is 13%, other is 6%, and Black is 3%. I want to point out that the Black population in Albany in the year 2000 was 8%. In 2010, it went down to 4% and then down to 3% in 2020. The city is primarily renters. 52% of the renters are cost burdened. 25% are severely cost burdened. To be cost burdened means spending large amounts of income on housing and is not sustainable in the long run. 45% of Asian households are cost burdened. 50% of Hispanic households are cost burdened. 70% of Black households are cost burdened. No wonder our population is going down. 18% of the population makes less than $25,000 a year. Census data shows that households of color are more likely to be cost burdened than white non-Hispanic households. There are at least 2 food banks in Albany. One is at the high school on the 2nd and 4th Fridays of the month. The lines are getting longer. There's another food bank at the village that used to just be once a week, and now it's 5 days a week. For a community that says we value diversity, rent stabilization would go a long way to help our families of color. In a letter to the commission, a landlord stated, quote, "Why should it be the responsibility of those in the business of providing rental housing to subsidize rents for their renters?" End of quote. There is nothing in rent stabilization that requires a landlord to subsidize their tenant. Under rent stabilization, the landlord is guaranteed a fair rate of return. If that is not enough for the landlord, they are in effect asking the tenant to subsidize them. When a landlord sets the rent, I assume they take into consideration the cost of the mortgage and fees, insurance, maintenance, and then an additional amount to give themselves a fair rate of return as they are guaranteed by law. They can set the rent as high as the market will bear or even higher if they want. No one interferes with that determination of rent. The state of California guarantees landlords a fair rate of return. What other investment, business investment, is there in the state that guarantees a fair rate of return? Just a second here. Sorry, I lost my place. There is a way to guarantee the, I'm sorry, I'm very nervous about this. There is a way to guarantee, make sure under rent stabilization that landlords are guaranteed a fair rate of return. In the city of Alameda and in Richmond, the rent stabilization contains what they call MNOI, which stands for Maintenance of Net Operating Income. This allows the landlord to raise the rent higher than would normally be allowed. In Richmond, a landlord is allowed to charge up to a 15% rent increase in 1 year, with excess being allowed to be charged in subsequent years. That 15% is to allow the landlord to maintain a fair rate of return. If we pass rent stabilizations, I want the landlord's right of rate of return codified and protected. So landlords, if you are guaranteed a fair rate of return under rent stabilization, why would you oppose it? I can only assume it's because you want more than a fair rate of return. On the state of California franchise tax website, it states, quote, "As a California property owner, the state tax code allows you to claim deductions for mortgage interest, property taxes, repairs, maintenance, insurance, and even depreciation." On the federal government website, under the question, "What deductions can I take as an owner of rental property?" the answer had 6 short paragraphs. I will just read the first one. If you receive rental income from the rental of a dwelling unit, there are certain rental expenses you may deduct on your tax return. Those expenses may include mortgage interest, property tax, operating expenses, depreciation, and repairs. So yes, there can be extensive expenses involved with rental property as an investment. Yes, it can be a hassle to get insurance as in other investments, but many can be written off as business expenses. In a letter from a landlord, he poses what he calls a philosophical question. Does everyone have a right to live in Albany, even if they cannot afford to do so? Are you saying based on your income, you may not be entitled to live here? My husband and I fell into that category when we first moved here. Does that mean we're not entitled? Housing is not like any other commodity and should not be treated as such. Housing is essential for a healthy life. And I know that you landlords recognize this. You say things like you are providing a service, not just a product. So you know it's not just another commodity. You want to be called housing providers, not landlords, because you perceive it to be a noble calling. I feel as though being a homeowner is one of the greatest privileges I have. When we bought our house in Albany, we were house poor, another term for cost burdened. We ate nothing but peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch for about 10 years. We did that so our daughter could go to a good public school. That is the reason a lot of families make many sacrifices to live in Albany. We have no stock portfolio. My home is what allowed my family to build wealth. I have lived in Albany for 40 years. According to Zillow, my house has increased more than $1 million since we purchased it. Those rental properties that you are lucky to own are building wealth for you and your families. By paying the rent, the tenants are helping you build wealth. All property in Albany is valuable and is only increasing in value. I believe that a community is stronger when there are people from all walks of life, income levels, and color. I want to protect families of color. I'm always racking my brain to come up with ideas to raise money for housing. One idea I have put out to the city council is to raise the tax rate on short-term rentals, which in some cases take housing away from the rental market. I'd like to see them raise it to 15%, which is what other cities are charging. The extra 5% could go to a housing fund. I would love to hear from some of you if you have ideas on how to raise money for a housing fund in Albany. My dream for Albany is that we pass a housing bond so that we can raise money for various housing projects and subsidies. Sorry, this was long. Thank you. In conclusion, I'm getting to the end here. It's the last page. I would like to see rent increases limited to 60% of CPI or 2.5%, whatever is less. Codify the fair rate of return for landlords. Allow additional increases to meet the fair rate of return. Provide a process for owners to petition for additional increases. Rent increases once every 12 months. No increase allowed in 12 months after move-in, and no banking of rent increases. Thank you. It's not on my list, but you could add it on yours.
Thank you so very much. That was very thoughtful and thorough. I'd just like to say a little something, being that I am a renter and I've been here over 20 years. And it struck me as, and I don't know how to, I don't think I have the words, but when one of the housing providers brought up the example of a three-bedroom apartment and the kids going to school, because that's exactly who I am. I moved here now 22 years ago from Richmond with my 4 children. Best schools, great. But then when I heard the rest of the story, I guess I was supposed to move out after my kids graduated and leave Albany. I don't know how to really take that. I didn't leave. But what does it say about us in terms of what I brought to this community, even sitting on this commission? Have I not brought anything to this city? Am I just to say, thank you for the schools, thank you for educating my children, see you later? I agree with pretty much everything you have to say. I agree with what you have to say. I want to be as objective as possible, because I do know that insurance, I have to pay insurance too on my car. I have to pay insurance on the rental that I have. And I understand that there are costs involved. And I appreciate you saying that there need to be mechanisms that are built in, so people who are owners are able to keep themselves above water, and maybe even a little bit more than that, because they have put the time and effort. But I also think we need to think about this as we are human beings, and we need to be thinking about each other in that way, as a renter for the people who I rent from, but as those people look at me in the same holistic way. So that's pretty much all I have to say. And I really am thankful to be here. I don't know if I've told you guys this before, but I am a dialysis patient. I'm disabled. I have, my means are not much. I'm on disability. I have to be hooked up to a machine 3 times a week just to stay alive. And I do everything to come here and be a productive part of this city, even though there are those people in this city who feel like I should have left a long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for comments so far. I just want to say that I think people are really scared about just certain terms without really necessarily understanding what they entail. So when we get to the point of making specific recommendations, I just want to advise to city staff to consider an education process for whatever policies are passed, because people just get scared. I mean, we do have some rent limits already in place at the state level, so that is already existing. And if I'm understanding and reading this charts correctly, the average increases in Albany don't even meet the limit. So I think people might be scared of what rent stabilization might imply. There's also different elements of rent stabilization ordinances. It's not only the rent limits, but the unit specific eligibilities and the notice period. So I think there's going to be one of the challenges for the city staff is to kind of educate both housing providers as well as the residents. And perhaps through that process, there could be a better understanding of what these policies aim to achieve. So I hope that's something that is taken into account.
Thank you to all my colleagues for their comments. I really appreciate this discussion. A couple of points and then some specific direction. I want to appreciate all of Leslie's work on this topic. I think especially the chart showing the rent increases compared to CPI and compared to 1482 maximum allowable rent increases. I think that illustrates the issue here pretty thoroughly, of that we have had rents go up by up around 30% over about 6 years. And I think that is unsustainable. That average rents are going up that quickly, and that is below 1482. That illustrates that 1482's limit is too high. It is too permissive of a rent increase, because I don't think anyone should go through having their rent increase by 30% over 6 years, especially given that we know that working class people, their incomes are not increasing with inflation even, let alone to that standard. And I would add to that analysis that Leslie did that, when Councilmember Preston Jordan and I looked at some of this issue with census data, it showed that in that same period, rents had been moving faster than inflation by about 10%. So we know that rents are outpacing what working people can afford, and they're outpacing inflation, and that's the problem we're trying to correct for. Now, I think it's also important to note, and this will come up with every item this commission looks at, that rent control, just like just cause, just like everything else, is not a panacea. It is not a silver bullet that will solve the housing crisis or stop there being homelessness in our area. That is a huge crisis that we need a full court press of policies to address. But rent control is one of the things that can address part of it. And it doesn't do everything, but it does do something important. And the fact that it doesn't do everything, and that we may have to balance some effects with increased housing production, doesn't mean that rent stabilization isn't a good idea. So it has to be combined with housing construction, and our housing element tries to do that. I will note for one of our public comments, encouraging housing construction, while a very important topic, is not the main goal of this committee. We are considering the policies that were in the housing element mostly related to tenants, as that is the charge we were given by the city council. I would encourage people to talk to the city council and advocate on increasing housing production and funding that, because it's something we desperately need. As was shown in the studies that are attached to the staff report, while rent control is not a panacea, it does have an important effect. It prevents displacement. That is hugely important. It prevents people from losing their homes. It prevents people who are on that edge or hanging on by their fingernails from being displaced from higher income areas like Albany. And while there are pretty moderate negative impacts that have been shown in that research, I think those can be counterbalanced by complementary policy like housing construction. We have to acknowledge that these studies, like they should, are looking at rent control in isolating its effect. And they all conclude that there's pretty small negative effects that we can counterbalance. Further, I think we have to acknowledge the reality of costs for landlords and the reality of what of those costs do rise and what don't. Because as I believe Margie mentioned, there are some of those costs that don't. We are unique, I believe, in the developed world to have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, to have mortgages be a write-off on your taxes, and in California, Prop 13, which fixes the largest part of your property tax at the place you bought it at. That is collectively, to my knowledge, one of the biggest government handouts in assistance for property owners and landlords. And that means that the cost of actually owning your home and renting it out, or owning your apartment building, is not going to be increasing with inflation or with other costs. Now, other costs like insurance, like the maintenance, may be increasing faster, but it means that the largest part, your mortgage, is not increasing as fast. And that means that I think there is good reason to limit rent increases because it is not increasing as fast as the general inflation or cost of a representative sample of goods, which is what CPI represents. Now, as I said, some costs do go up. There are edge cases. There are cases where insurance goes up hugely in a small period, or there are huge maintenance costs. And again, like Margie mentioned, there are ways to solve that. Other cities allow extraordinary rent increases when they're necessary. I think the easiest way to do that is to have a rent review officer that looks at these cases and says, looks at the facts and says, yes, you do have an extraordinary situation here where you can go past the usual allowable limit. I think we can implement that without too much difficulty if it's kept pretty simple and if it's done smartly, which I think our staff is more than capable of doing, as they've been able to show to me that they can make a lot of very impressive things happen with pretty minimal amounts of increase in cost and staffing. Lastly, before I get to some specific points about what this ordinance I think should include when it comes back, this issue I think hugely relates to our last issue of rent control because these policies, to my thinking, have to go hand in hand to some extent. Because if you don't have just cause, then you effectively don't have rent control to some extent because of vacancy decontrol. If a landlord would like to increase their rent and they cannot under rent control, but they do not are not covered by just cause, can evict their tenant for any reason, they can evict their tenant and then they can set a new rent. Similarly, if you have just cause but you don't have rent control, that means that people can effectively evict their tenants by raising rents past what they can afford without using any of the eviction reasons in just cause. So I think it's very important that we acknowledge that if we want to do either of those things, we should probably do both of them. One final thing, and I don't want to go too long about it, so I appreciate everyone's patience, but I know we heard from some folks that they are worried about this and that they are ending situations that are beneficial for lower income people because of fear for this. And I would encourage them, even if you are going to leave the rental market or end those arrangements eventually if these sorts of policies pass, I would implore people not to do it right now. This is going to be a long process. And if that situation works for you now and you're just worried about rent control, you can probably continue to do it for another year or two before this policy passes. The city government is slow. We are going to be looking at these policies and recommending them for the rest of this year. And then we are going to be looking at specific policies and recommending something, I believe, at the end of our next year of discussion. So it's going to be some time before the city council decides whether to implement this or not. So if you are doing something that works for you now and you are just worried about rent control, please keep doing it if you can. And if you have to get out of the rental market later, please cross that bridge when this is a thing that could happen in the near future and not a thing that is still pretty hypothetical. You will have plenty of notice. We are legally required, the city government, to give notice. On specific policies, I would say, very importantly, I think any local Albany rent stabilization should apply to single-family homes as standard, as I think that is a big part of our rental market that is probably old enough to be covered by rent control, but not currently covered. I think it should, in terms of getting to the issue that I think several of us have mentioned around people who are not registering, I think you should only allow rent increases, as some other cities do, if landlords have registered or pay their business license tax. It seems like a great way to motivate people to register if their rent increase is ruled null and void if they haven't done so. I think there should be a once yearly rent increase allowed. That seems pretty standard. That seems like not a difficult hurdle. And ideally, I would love it to apply to anything over 15 years of age. I know Costa-Hawkins precludes that, but I think we should future-proof this to some extent, and have a rent review officer for extraordinary circumstances. Finally, for the level, I think fairly reasonable would be CPI or 5%, whichever is lower. I think that's a pretty easy one. And I believe the staff report had a show of CPI of what it has been over the past couple of years, or maybe that was me looking it up, but it has been usually around 2 to 3%. Which I think is reasonable and shows a representative cost of a basket of goods for a normal working family. So I think that is a reasonable way to do it, and how several other cities have done it to create something that is workable. That's the end of my recommendations and comments for now on this item. Are there any other comments from members of the commission?
I have some more. Margie, first of all, I really appreciated your commentary and your thoughtfulness in writing it and the emotion behind it. I hear it. Okay, so that was a good job. Aaron, what about means testing? You neglected to talk about that. And don't we think rent controls to protect low and very low income cost burden people? Shouldn't there be means testing for wealthy people that are in a rent controlled unit?
I'm not in support of using means testing for this. I think if people are worried about this being a costly and difficult bureaucracy to implement, means testing is going to increase that by an order of magnitude. I work in affordable housing. Means income certification is a lot of work and takes a lot of effort. And to put that on this program, I think will make it very difficult to implement for our staff.
So because of the cost, it's okay for a rich person to stay in a rent controlled unit. Just want to make sure I understand that.
Sure. And I would further say that, I know there are rich people who might benefit from that program, but I think that no one should pay more than 30% of their income for housing. And as much as we can create that using this program, then we should. I acknowledge rent control is not a perfect solution to a problem, but it's one of the tools we have, and I would support using it.
Well, I have Section 8 tenants. I love working with Section 8. Section 8 means tests their people every year. So I know that there's a vehicle for it. To me, again, if you're trying to protect people, I don't know why you wouldn't means test, preserve the affordable housing instead of letting someone stay. So I'm adamant about that. I really think that's important. Margie, your comment about African-American population really resonated with me because since Berkeley passed its rent control, the African-American population in Berkeley has declined precipitously. And I did Google this to read to you. In 1970, the African-American population of Berkeley was about 23.5%. By 2010, the number had dropped to 10%. In 2019, it was 7.9. So rent control didn't protect them there. I just want to point that out. I had proposed to the state senators a Section 9 voucher, housing for Californians, a 2% sales tax California-wide to go into a fund to provide a voucher to either augment or replace a Section 8 so that everybody that needed to or could or had low income would have access to a housing supplement. Perhaps Albany should consider a 2% sales tax to raise funds for a Section 9 Albany voucher. I do believe Section 8 is a very vital part of housing, and I believe that the government and everybody here should participate in it, not just the property owners being cost burdened by rent control, but everybody in a society that is unified contributes through sales taxes, through consumption, to a fund that allows people that are not able to afford market rate rents to have a subsidy. And then on the property tax, Aaron, the Prop 13, yes, that's locked in. But cities and counties pass voter-approved bonded indebtedness and measures all the time. And I can tell you that, like, my property taxes in Oakland, almost 50% of them were voter-approved extra taxes. It isn't like it's locked at that low rate. There's ways around it. And they're attacking the Prop 13 exemption consistently. They want to separate commercial properties, et cetera, to try to bifurcate the tax roll to raise more money. Yet in California, homes seem to turn over every 7 to 10 years. So the state actually gets a rolling increase in the tax roll every decade. So they get increases as well. I'm just wanted to point all that stuff out.
I just want to say I really appreciate that. Thank you. There's something else I want to. I've heard many landlords say they want to be called housing providers. Provide means to give. They're not, landlords are not giving. I wish you would come up with a different term beside housing provider. If you don't like the term landlord, something that to me more accurately describes what you're doing. I do think it's a good thing to provide housing, and we have a lot of great landlords, and I do believe the landlords that show up at these meetings and call in are the responsible landlords, and I appreciate you. Thank you.
Any further comments from commission members? Seeing none. Thank you very much, everyone, for the discussion. I think it's been really great. And thank you, Leslie, for all the work on this. Hopefully you have some stuff to chew on. With that, we'll close this item and move to item 6, our announcements, which I believe the first one we have. Yes, that's under item 6. Which is item 6.1, which is about the official state income limits for 2025. Leslie, if you want to say
Yeah,
words
I
on
just
that.
wanted to share with you that every year the state does distribute the official income limits for 2025. So I sent you all the link to it. So that sets the annual median income for households based on income level and size of households. So yes, so there it is. I think we got up to, I don't know, I always look at a household of 3 because that's what I am, but I think we've increased a bit. So we're still quite high, but that is what is used to set affordable housing rates and affordable housing projects, as well as other regulatorily restricted units. So I just wanted to share that and not to preclude any other announcements that we all have. Yes.
I would just like to add something to that. They recently in Albany, we opened the Saha Affordable Housing Project. I'm in a group, Albany Thrives Together, that works with unhoused people. So one of our clients applied for the Saha housing, and she initially got accepted, but then it turned out that her yearly income was $33,000. And last year, for one person, the yearly income for affordable was $31,000. She went to her boss and asked her boss to lower her hours so she would only make $31,000. It was too late. She didn't get it. I mean, I noticed now the rate has gone up this year. If it only been 6 months later, she would have gotten it. But so, these numbers are looked at by people that are doing housing.
Thank you for sharing. Are there any further comments or questions on this item from the public? Seeing none. For announcements, I'll briefly mention 2 things. I'll just direct everyone's attention. May is Affordable Housing Month. I believe the City Council did a resolution about this on their Monday meeting, and I would encourage everyone to take a look at the slew of great events that are being put on around the Bay Area and in the East Bay specifically. You can go to the East Bay Housing Organization's EBHO's site to find those opportunities. There are a variety of film showings, panels, educational events, and likewise that are great if people are interested in the subject. I'll also just mention one other thing. I was glad to hear generalized support for Section 8 from this commission, which I think is great. I will just direct everyone's attention to the fact that our administration has suggested a budget that essentially guts Section 8. So direct people to maybe take a look at that budget. And if you have strong thoughts on it, you can always submit comments to your congresspeople. With that, we will go from announcements to our adjournment. Thank you to the Vice Chair, members of the Commission for the discussion, members of the public who joined us, our staff, and Leslie, and everyone else who made this meeting possible. We are adjourned until our meeting on Wednesday, June 4th. Thank you.